Welcome to Housing for Huntsvillians, the podcast, a podcast about one couple's quest to eliminate homelessness in Huntsville by August 2026. Okay, well, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, how are you?
I am, I'm well. I'm a little nervous to do this one because I don't really know, I'm not an expert on this topic. And I probably would have been served by having a guest besides just us, but I didn't find out about this until recently, and I was not able to get it together to get a guest on, so I'm just going to talk it through. So anyway, what we're talking about today is on September 28th, the Huntsville City Council will vote on whether to create a Huntsville Sustainability Commission. So this is something that Jackson Tolbert talked to us about on his episode. So if you want more information on that, check out that episode if you haven't listened to it. It was really great. But I was thinking about this, and I'm not against necessarily creating a commission for sustainability. I think that what I really care about is making sure that this commission, or, to me, if we want Huntsville to be more sustainable, there's one thing that the city government could do that would have the highest impact and the lowest cost and other benefits, the most number of and the most important other benefits as well. And that thing, perhaps not shockingly, if you know anything about me or this podcast or this project, is legalizing and streamlining more dense, affordable housing near jobs and transit.
I'm shocked.
Surprise.
Tell me more.
I will.
Awesome.
I will. So, I am not an expert on environmental policy or environmental anything. But I have read enough to know that, not know, but had a strong opinion that, there are only so many levers a city government can pull when it comes to sustainability. And usually when we talk about sustainability, it's like either regulating or incentivizing private actors to do things in a certain way. So, build buildings in a more green fashion, or ban certain kinds of pollution, or incentivize people to buy electric vehicles. Like, these are the kinds of levers that governments can pull to create more environmental sustainability.
Makes sense.
Right. But I did think going in, I guess a few days ago when I saw this announcement, I was like, I really feel like all those things are fine and good. Each has pros and cons, but the highest impact thing the city government could do is build dense, affordable housing near jobs and transit. But I didn't want to just say that. Like, I wanted to have some evidence to back that up. So I wrote an op-ed, which I would love to get published. If anyone has any thoughts on where to pitch it, I would love that. But I thought, because this is about to come up for a vote, I would just kind of talk you through some of what I learned when writing this op-ed for this episode.
That sounds amazing.
Awesome. So, essentially, this commission would help guide the city through implementing recommendations in the Green 13 report, which the city published in 2010, and the Huntsville Environmental Sustainability Committee, HESC, updated in April of this year. And so, that's the stated purpose. But I think Green 13 report aside, like, ultimately what we'd want this commission to do is to make Huntsville greener, or do what the government has power to do to make Huntsville greener. And so when I talk about dense, affordable housing, I wanted to just kind of on a very high level go through why I believe that, beginning with what density means. What do I mean when I say dense housing?
That makes sense.
So density is the opposite of sprawl. So some cities are sprawling. In these cities, most residents live in subdivisions filled with single-family homes, each with their own large lawn. People in these neighborhoods usually can't access jobs, park, grocery stores, etc., without driving. Other cities are more dense. In these cities, many residents live in more affordable and more environmentally friendly types of homes. So these could include apartments, condos, townhomes, tiny homes, ADUs, modular homes, and SROs, single-room occupancy housing.
So the antithesis of a lot of what we are at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, Huntsville is somewhat sprawling and somewhat dense. It's actually, that's a good question. How dense is Huntsville? I think it is becoming more dense, which is good. But it's definitely pretty sprawling. Like, cities in the US tend to be more sprawling than like cities in Europe, for example. So like San Francisco is like way more sprawling than like Paris.
And I would say that we've gotten better at density over especially the last decade, because more people have actually wanted to live in the city. That we're getting way more apartments in like areas that traditionally have been single family, but it's a slow transition. Historically, we have been go out to the suburbs, massive suburban sprawl. I mean, that's essentially what Madison is.
Yeah. So, so because these homes take up less land in dense cities, apartments and townhomes take up less land than single-family homes. Dense cities are more walkable and easier to get around via walking, bicycling, and transit. So that's density versus sprawl. And the thing that I really want to get across is that all else equal, density is more sustainable than sprawl. So, researchers from the London School of Economics to Nature have been saying for decades that sprawl is just not a very sustainable way to develop land. And so there are three main reasons why density is more sustainable than sprawl. And I want to go through the first, which is density reduces driving. So when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions in the U.S., transportation is the number one contributor. So in 2017, for example, cars, trucks, and SUVs and vans accounted for 1/5 of total greenhouse gas emissions.
Jeez.
We could get the same carbon dioxide reduction as shutting down 28 coal-fired power plants if the average person just drove 10% less each year. So taking transit over driving by yourself reduces CO2 emissions by 45%. Obviously, walking or riding a bicycle, e-bike, or scooter is even better when it comes to emissions. Sprawl effectively forces people to drive more often and for longer distances. So...
yeah, that definitely plays out here.
Totally, yeah. And, commute times in Huntsville are pretty good right now. I want to say we have a, average 20-minute commute time. But if we continue to bring people to the area and we don't build densely, and we don't build in such a ways to facilitate other ways to get around, we're going to have longer commutes. Like, that's just going to happen. And we could build more roads, but that doesn't change the fact that even if people don't necessarily have to drive for a longer period of time, more people will be driving, which will be not great for the environment. So, yeah, every road we build represents more people on the road, which represents more pollution. And asphalt itself is actually really bad for the environment. So all kinds of reasons, like we don't want to build around car dependency. So research shows people living densely have shorter commutes on average and do less driving overall. And, a lot of people say, well, more people are buying electric vehicles, so we don't have to worry about driving. But the reality is that, again, the roads themselves are polluting, and there's also other pollution associated with electric vehicles, such as battery waste.
Oh, yeah. Like lithium, from what I've heard, is terrible.
Right. So, you know, and it's not just driving itself. There's, you know, creating, owning, operating, maintaining, parking, and disposing of cars. Like, all that is really environmentally destructive. So yeah, I mean, if we keep building sprawling car-dependent suburbs and then maybe slapping some paint on a few sections of roadway and calling it bike-friendly, you know, that will never meaningfully increase Huntsville's transportation alternatives. We really need to choose as a city to build around humans as opposed to cars.
It's like a bunch of Band-Aids that are going to get harder to come back from the longer we do it, essentially.
Yeah, exactly. You know, we need to build our homes near where people want to go. Like, that's how you reduce driving. So yeah. And again, and we'll link to the op-ed draft in the show notes, which will, you know, the op-ed links to all the sources so you can see, you know, all the studies that back up what I'm saying. And if you have studies that show otherwise, like, I would love to know. Still learning about this, as I said, but you know, this is my understanding of reality, and it makes sense. And sometimes things, you know, are counterintuitive, and so I'm not saying because it makes sense it's true, but it does have research behind it, and it does make sense. So anyway, that's why I'm saying it.
You have receipts.
I have receipts. I'm open to new receipts, but I have receipts. All right, number 2, the second reason density is more sustainable than sprawl. Density requires less land than sprawl.
Oh yeah.
I mean, again, like, pretty obvious, pretty hard to argue with.
You don't need a massive yard for density.
Right. So yeah, density is one of the most effective ways a city could possibly protect natural resources. When you build up, you don't have to build out.
Yeah.
We can keep more of our land undeveloped. So one thing that I didn't think about before reading, but I read and makes a lot of sense, is that sprawling development destroys the large, connected, natural wildlife habitats that many endangered and threatened species depend on for survival.
Oh, yeah.
So it's not like a piece of land is just like, okay, you know, there are like 3 marmots on this piece of land, and, you know, the marmots can just move. You know, a lot of species really need this land to be connected to each other. And so every bit of land that we develop infringes on that connected natural habitat.
You upset balances.
Sorry, what?
You upset balances.
Right, exactly. And one thing that I thought about was, having lived in California, sprawl also is part of what has caused the polluting natural disasters like the California wildfires. So when you build in what researchers call the urban wildlife interface, as they've done in California, because it's so expensive because of regulation to build in cities, then suddenly you have homes in fire zones where there weren't homes before, and the homes themselves create somewhat of a fire risk. But, you know, a big portion of it is that, you know, when the fires happen, the homes get consumed, which is terrible for the inhabitants, obviously. But the smoke from these houses being burned is also really, really bad for the environment. Yeah. It's very toxic. So anyway, it's a nightmare that's totally avoidable. Okay. 3. The third reason density is more sustainable than sprawl is that dense homes are naturally greener. So a lot of people will say, well, you know, urban areas produce more pollution and use more energy on a per capita basis than like rural areas. And that's true sometimes, but here's the reality. The biggest predictor of whether of like your individual level of emissions is income. So the richest of the rich tend to live in cities. And so, yeah, that's going to be true. But if you hold income steady, people who live in dense cities use less energy and produce significantly fewer carbon emissions per capita than suburb dwellers. So it makes sense. Dense homes tend to be smaller. They require fewer building materials per family and require less energy to heat and cool than larger homes. And this is important because heating and cooling alone account for about 43% of the average home's energy use.
Yeah, especially here.
Yeah, right. It's like in California, maybe not. It's more temperate. But in places where we have extreme heat and, it gets decently cold, it takes a lot of energy to heat and cool a home. And a larger home is more expensive to heat and cool. I haven't seen this, but it also makes sense that, a condo or a townhome or an apartment, anything where there are fewer exterior walls per home, it would seem to save money on heating and cooling because you have the insulation effects of the other homes.
And also, like, during the winter, like when it'd be really cold, living on the top floor, I wouldn't have to use the heater much at all because you still do get the rising heat from the other units below you. So not all the
right.
Yeah, you basically capitalize off of the other units around you and all the less outer walls coming into play.
Right. I would think. I don't know, but it would make sense to me.
It definitely translated into something.
So yeah, and then there's other pollution. For example, when people live densely, instead of maintaining individual lawns for their kids to play in by themselves, they can live within walking or biking or transit distance of a park. And that lawns are incredibly terrible for the environment. They waste a ton of water. They usually require pesticides and fertilizers that are terrible for the environment. There's runoff issues. There's the, gasoline that it takes to run your lawnmower. And there's just tons and tons of waste associated with lawns. And they're lonely. Who wants their kids, playing alone in the backyard versus playing with other kids at a park? Who wants to have to load everybody into the minivan to get to a park? Why not take a stroll? So yeah, dense housing is more environmentally friendly than sprawl for those three reasons. And so, obvious question, why don't we have more density? Since density is so great. Well,
why don't we have more density?
It's and the other thing I want to say is not only is dense housing better for the environment, but it's also just naturally more affordable. A single family home is more expensive to build. Land to house one home and a lawn is more expensive than, when it takes less land. That's also expensive, especially in high demand areas where land is very expensive. And, for many reasons, density is better for the economy of the individual families that are living densely, and it's better for the economy generally speaking. Sprawl costs the U.S. economy more than $1 trillion annually by one estimate. So when you find a solution that benefits both the environment and the economy, you should probably implement it. So why, considering that, is Huntsville so spread out? Well, I wanted to point out that this is not the way Huntsville has always been. In the 19th century, Huntsville was a dense city, well connected by streetcars. We had, townhomes. And it wasn't until 1963 that Huntsville banned dense, naturally affordable housing in more than 85% of the city through our exclusionary zoning ordinance. These ordinances have a disturbing history and an uncertain future as more cities begin to recognize the economic, environmental, and social wreckage of these laws. And if you want to learn more about the history and future, check out the links in the op-ed, but I don't want to go too deeply on that at this point. But what I want to say is, if this ordinance passes, regardless of how many people sit on the commission or who is elected or how they're selected, appointed, I don't know how that's going to work. The one thing I want to get across is I want everyone on this commission and everyone involved in the process and everyone at City Hall and everyone on the council to understand what research from top institutions shows is the highest leverage thing the city and the new commission could do to make Huntsville greener. Please encourage everyone involved to do whatever's in their power to legalize and streamline dense, naturally affordable housing throughout our city. It's great for the environment. It's great for our economy. It's great for our families. And it's awesome. And we should do it.
Totally. No, that seems like a no-brainer, but isn't always the case.
It is not always the case. And again, the vote is on September 28th. You can read the ordinance online. I'll try to link to it from the op-ed, from the show notes. And
Yeah, and if you're listening to this on an actual podcast platform like Spotify, Apple, any of those, go to housingforhuntsvillians.com/podcast. And there you'll find a dedicated page for this episode as well, where we have basically just better content authoring capabilities. So we'll have links to everything there, but we'll also get those into the show notes that go out to all the podcast platforms.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you guys. And we'll be back next week.